All right, we're live. Welcome to everybody who watches this live now and in the future. This is the first slug for the month of, what is this, August? Good Lord, the year's almost over. Anyways, we got a topic for the day. We're gonna do our normal thing. We'll start about the talk. I'm sure we'll start on the topic. I'm sure we'll meander. So, D-Dub's got something to say. Go ahead, D-Dubs, you can start.
Thank you. It's actually just back on the NVIDIA. Yeah, the biggest problem, excuse me, the biggest problem is not just the drivers, is the models they support. Because like 555 has gotten a lot better as long as you've got a supported card. 5.6 will be even better. Again, as long as you got a newer card. If you got an older card, you're just out of luck. That's just you're at Nouveau drivers or nothing.
Yeah.
So it has gotten a lot better. So I wanted to, as much as I dislike NVIDIA, I have to defend it. It has gotten better with Wayland.
I've thought about taking the NVIDIA card out of that computer and putting it in my main machine. I won't be able to run both because I don't have that many PCIe lanes. And even the 30 series still takes a ton of power, and I'm not even sure if I have a big enough power supply for it, to be honest with you. But I've thought about it. But I have this really weird fucking monitor setup, and I have two monitors, but it counts as three monitors because it's that stupid LG dual up that I had to have. I regret that purchase. It's cool as fuck. It's also the most pain in the ass I've ever had with a monitor in my entire life. Like half the time it comes back from sleep and the brightness is way down, and sometimes it doesn't really work really well with the KVM switch that I have. So
Yep.
sometimes the whole thing freezes. So
I mean, I would for you, I would not do it, but I just so
yeah.
that anybody happen to be listening, there is a lot of issues, but it is on the improvement overall.
Yeah, I I pissed a lot of people off by saying I use Windows to edit my videos. Like, oh, why didn't? And a lot of people was like, why didn't you buy a Mac? I was like, this was a third of the price of a Mac. Like, yes, I could have got a really old Mac, I suppose, but this was newer, had a higher end graphics card, and was a third of the price. So, Trollbus, go ahead.
Yeah. Something else also I thought about is that you could. I don't know if your motherboard supports KVM pass-through, but you could have put your Windows card in your main rig and then emulate Windows in it directly, so you don't need another computer. And you could also like put a firewall there, put a VPN, block all the Windows garbage, have like a snapshot, just like like your you have BTRFS, so you could put snapshots on the Windows, revert every time Windows does something evil, do all that good stuff. I think some ordinary gamer, another YouTuber, very successful, he does that. I think I
Yeah,
think he was using Mac OS or Windows or something.
Muda's
So
really big on the virtualization stuff, but he also has a huge motherboard with a lot of PCIe lanes, and I do not. Um, my board also doesn't have a lot of PCIe slots. It only has one by 16 slot at all. The other ones are
mm,
four. And then there's like a two or whatever it is, the really small one. So I wouldn't be able to put both of them in there. And I have a just pro tip: never buy an NZXT case that's small, like a mid tower. There's no room in it, like zero room, and no airflow in this at all. So it's not the greatest case ever. It'll be the last time I ever build a PC on my own. To be honest with you, I wasn't good at selecting parts. All right. So what we're gonna do, we'll go ahead and jump into the topic. We don't need to mess around with my Windows woes. We'll our the topic that won the poll this time was our Linux origin stories, how we got started with Linux. So we're gonna go around the horn to those of you who want to participate. I'm not gonna go in like order or whatever. Whoever raises their hand gets to go first, and it's gonna be Steve. So Steve, how did you get started with Linux?
How I got started with Linux? Well, that's a funny story. I was working for Apple at the time, and I got sick of staring at Mac OS for 8 hours a day. So I was like, I had Windows on my own PC, private PC, personal PC, basically, and I wanted something else. I started digging around, and I was like, there's only one third choice. It's Linux. And people are gonna facepalm when I say I chose Manjaro, and I stuck with it the entire time I was working for Apple until I came back home. I decided I don't want the same thing on all my computers. I want to find something different, different Linux distro to install on my systems, and that's where when I landed on Arch plus KDE, and that's where I've been ever since.
Arch fanboy.
Well, if it works, it works.
Yeah. All right, D-Dubs, go ahead.
It's actually kind of a cool, funny story. I actually started with Debian back in the 90s, and it was working for a storage company. The storage devices didn't have any network access, and people wanted to things like SNMTP monitoring, SNMTP alerts, email, those sorts of things. Well, none of that existed on the box. So we used a Linux box with as many serial ports as we could stuff in it, wrote some custom software, and that actually became like a translator. It would take the serial messages from the storage device and then turn around into emails, SNMP traps, monitoring, and so forth. It was actually really, really cool. It was a lot of fun. I came from a Unix background, but that was the first time I ever really learned about Linux and really used it. It was amazing.
Whenever anyone says Unix, I think of that scene in Jurassic Park. I know this. I'm sorry, I can't.
No, that's okay. My stuff actually predates that. Predates SGI and all that. It goes to Sun and before that Berkeley.
Yeah, I can't help it. I see that Jeff every time. War Thunder, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say with mine, I technically have two. One of them was when I was really young. I don't even remember exactly what year, but it would have been around the time, I think it was Fedora Core 2 or 3, somewhere in there. I don't remember exactly what it was. My brother was experimenting with Linux distros and whatnot, to the point where my dad went and found a computer in a dumpster and gave it to my brother because he was tired of reloading Windows XP on his computer. Because he would inevitably screw something up with Grub and fork Windows, and then he'd go to my father and go, "Can I borrow the Windows XP installation CD again so I can fix my computer?" And he got tired of it. But the real part where I got to know it was while I was actually working in an IT office in college, just to make some money on the side and whatnot. And the manager we had at the time was very much into Linux, very much into a lot of the different things it would do. But he got tired of hearing some of us students badmouth about Apple because he was Apple certified back in like the late 80s and whatnot. That was his jam back then. So he forced us for several months to do "I'm not allowed to use Windows in the office" challenge. And so we got to try different operating systems throughout. And I'd had a little experience by that point, but not a lot. So we did Mac OS for a month. And then more importantly, so I tried to do Zorn OS, but that was a disaster at the time. It was my own fault. I didn't understand NVIDIA drivers needed installed on Linux. I thought that just everything worked with kernel drivers, and that was far from the case. But we had a old Optiplex that we put Linux Mint on. That was his suggestion. And we used that in the office to do basically everything from IT support to dealing with tickets to remote desktop to everything. And after a month and a half, I actually pretty much liked Mint pretty well, though I ended up going across the entire Linux spectrum afterwards because reasons. But I mean, the big thing was that machine stayed in service. We had to kind of hide it from our IT manager because he didn't like Linux on the network. He wanted to kick it outside the firewall, and we just keep moving the machine around so he couldn't find it. For like 8 or 9 months before I left and went to a different job. So, I mean, we could do everything on it, and that kind of started my journey from there.
Linux Mint right from the beginning, huh?
Yeah, I started there, and you can say I've kind of ended there. But I kind of went to everything between from Arch to Fedora to Debian to everything else. I still like Debian. I think it's better.
Yeah. All right, Redstone, go ahead.
So my Linux journey is rather interesting because I never really daily driven Windows. I, so the first thing was going to use since my first PC was Ubuntu. And uh, yeah, later I noticed that Wayland support with NVIDIA was a bit difficult on Ubuntu since it's a bit older, so I switched to Arch.
Your
Then,
audio is really either you're not close enough to the microphone or you're breaking up.
okay, it's better
That's better. Yep.
now. Did you could you understand what I was saying, or should I repeat?
It was like you're the opposite of the Verizon commercial. You're in and out, so you probably might want to go ahead and start over.
So my I started with Linux since my first PC. Oh, wait, I think I have some audio problems right now.
No,
Not
you
sure
sound
why.
good.
Okay.
Way better than before.
So I was starting out with Kubuntu Linux since my first PC, so I never really daily driven Windows. And since then, I got to Arch since the NVIDIA drivers on Ubuntu didn't support Wayland good at the time. So I switched to Arch. Then the drivers broke, and I switched to an AMD card since I couldn't work with NVIDIA because everything on my screen was flickering that was actively being hardware accelerated. And yeah, now I've gotten over to NixOS since Arch was still a bit too unstable for me, and basically everything's fine now. I'm doing some music production, so I also switched to NixOS because of that, since I can now sync all my configurations with all other PCs and basically open my projects anywhere on any PC I have right here and laptop.
Cool. All right, fellow Jitsier, you're next. Don't forget to unmute yourself.
I take it you're talking about me.
Yeah, that's for whatever reason your name is fellow Jitsier. Very clever.
Yeah, well, my name is Don actually, but that's okay. I had to get into Chrome in order to make this thing work. When I tried to do it with Brave, I couldn't hear you guys at all. It was crazy. Anyway, this goes back to 2000, and I was working at a Holiday Inn as a night auditor, and my boss comes up to me, and they were using this old Unix-based system on their computer. Menus many levels deep, and he says, "Hey, I want a Unix-based system that I could run on my computer. Can you find one for me?" So I go looking around. I'd never heard of Linux at all, and I fell in love with the whole idea of being able to control your own computer and having the freedom to do what you want. I mean, that's what caused me to fall in love with computers to begin with. And so I literally started just working off of man files and all that. I think I bought a book somewhere, and I was trying to dual boot a Linux XP system with, or Windows XP system with Linux, Mandrake Linux, because I could download it. It would take me 3 days to download Mandrake Linux on an old telephone, slow as molasses internet connection. And because I lived in a small town, I lived in Aberdeen, South Dakota, and ultimately I got it to work. I got a dual boot to work, and I was able to transfer everything I did on Windows over to Mandrake. Took Windows off my computer completely. I was just using Mandrake, and then I got into trucking and found out that Wi-Fi connections at truck stops were horrible. And there was a testing thing where they had this big old black box that you would put into your USB slot, and it would give you a connection through your phone, your telephone hookup. This was completely new at that time, and so I volunteered for that. Ended up going back to Windows because Linux couldn't handle the thing, and it was ultra slow. And I was on Windows XP until basically Windows 10 came out, and my computer told me that it was too busy to do what I was asking it to do, which was only going to take 3 seconds. And I got pissed off and put Fedora on there, and I've been on Linux ever since.
Nice. Trollblast, you're next.
Yes. So for me, it's the first time I ever interacted with Linux. It would probably go back in between 2007 2012. I actually have the old CDs that my dad burned here of Ubuntu 6 all the way to 12. I don't know which one is which, honestly. It's one of these. So I was probably in between 5 to 10 at the time. He was just like wanting to show me like some cool thing he found out or something, and that was probably the first time I ever interacted with it. But it was just like, he put it on an old computer and I tried it and then I forgot about it existing, but then the next time I've probably used it would be when I really started actually thinking about Linux was probably all the way in 2019 when I was doing a like networking class or something. I mean, it was half networking. Like the first year is half networking, half programming, and then after the first year of school, you choose which one you want to go for. So the first year, I had a little bit of Linux, and when I remember using Ubuntu there, and I was like, oh yeah, like that old thing I used like a long time ago. And when it really opened my mind and I loved Linux, is I remember vividly the teacher showing me you can switch the TTY, and it kind of blew my mind. I was like, why isn't everything like this? Like you have a fallback TTY that you can fix everything with. Like this is magic. Like that's when it really realized that Linux was superior to Windows. And then after that, when so that was 2019. And then after that, I know, there was an Arch user in my class. I remember that there was one Arch user in my class.
And of course, you knew there was an Arch user in class because they had to tell everyone.
Yeah, I mean, he wasn't annoying, but I think he actually used GNOME actually, so he wasn't the typical Arch user, but he was so that was that. Then I know I installed Arch on my old from scratch at some point at that time, which I remember it took me a week. I don't know if it was in 2020 or 2019 though. That's the thing. I don't know if I learned about Luke Smith first, because that's really what happened and really got me into Linux is Luke Smith. But yeah, so because COVID happened in 2021. Because I don't know if I did the Arch install before or after COVID, but because of COVID, I was stuck inside doing online classes. I hated it so much. I hate online classes. That was the worst thing ever. No motivation. So of course I was on YouTube, and thanks to that, I found Luke Smith, and that's really what got me to think about actually using Linux on my main computer. Because I knew about Linux because the server and whatever, but I actually wanted to become a programmer. So I kind of forgot about Linux a little bit because it was first year you do half networking, half programming in that school, and then I went the programming path, and it was actually really annoying because it was C#, web dev, it was not fun. It's this Windows server that you have, it's all in C#. I don't know what's ASP.NET. Yeah, it's not fun. It wasn't fun. And then it was Java, which is also very well known to not be fun to program. So it was kind of annoying there. And that was the most fun stuff there was that. And then the other stuff was even worse. So I wasn't having a good time. And then I had no motivation. So I found Luke Smith. I kind of almost listened to him more than my classes. And then I realized I really love Linux. And then at that point, I think, or I installed Arch, and it took me a week to do it for the first time, but I learned tremendous amount of things. Or it was the time that I installed Fedora, because I installed Arch, then I didn't do anything with it the first time I did it, but it was more of a learning experience. And then at some point I installed Fedora, which is the first time I actually used Linux on the actual computer and I actually daily drived it. But I think Fedora was after the online classes. That was after that, because I remember having to use Windows because of that school I just talked about. So I wouldn't be able to use that on the main computer. And then I used Fedora for a while. I customized GNOME. It was my first real experience of like customizing and doing things. And it's when I realized I didn't like GNOME nor Fedora. And yeah, that was kind of like my introduction to actually using it. And then later I installed OpenSUSE on my main computer, thanks to Matt. I mean, at first I was actually thinking like something else. And then I realized, yeah, I'm probably just going to do something easy. So OpenSUSE. And then I switched to Arch after, and I'm here now.
All right, cool. Silicoids, I think that's how you say your name. Go ahead, you're next.
All right, so my journey began in 1998, searching around my local big box retailer for software, and at the bottom shelf there was an alternative operating systems shelf. Caught my eye was a Red Hat box, and it was a very hefty box. It was easy to install. It had a guide, but back in those days, it was pretty much dependency hell and recursive dependencies. The first distro I really daily drove every day was something called Corel Linux, which is a Debian-based one. And I pretty much daily drove it until like 2006, 2007, various Debian distros. Journey led me to Mac and then back to Linux eventually.
Nice. All right, what are you using now?
I'm using Debian SID.
So still on the Debian. Cool. Steve, go ahead. Don't forget to unmute yourself.
Sorry. I just wanted to add that I just remembered that between Manjaro and Arch Linux, there was Mint, and there was OpenSUSE Leap. For whatever reason, I chose Leap instead of the one you're using,
Tumbleweed. Yeah.
Tumbleweed. I chose Leap, and Mint. I managed to break Mint within 5 minutes of installing it.
Steve, how do you break Mint? I mean, how is that even possible?
Easy. I'll tell you how easy, because every time because during the installation I chose Lebanon as my locale, although I was in Ireland at the time, but it's a habit, and bad habits die hard. So whenever it used to boot to the desktop, it used to tell me you're missing locale files or whatever, and I started trying to install them via apt, tried installing them via the control panel and whatever, and started messing with it. Within 5 to 10 minutes, it was unbootable, and plus it threw me this auto remove thing to clean up. So I followed. I said, and at the time I had only 120 gig SSDs. I was like, I want to clean up my hard drive. I want to free up some space. So auto remove, it removed itself. So
you pulled a Linus.
I pulled a Linus.
Oh, I've been there. I've been there. I Linus to myself.
That's great.
And when I tried OpenSUSE Leap, I was like in the same shoes as everyone else. Zipper I had a 500 down connection when I was in Ireland. It was awesome, but I wasn't able to benefit from it because Zipper was so slow. And I was like, I'm installing only 250 megabytes worth of packages. Why is it taking so long? Uninstall. And then I saw the Arch ISO, and that's where it went from there. And I've been on Arch ever since, and I'm not going anywhere else. I'm just doing this challenge because people on Aurora, which is a universal blue image, for the only reason that I want to prove to people that I do try other distros, but I will always end up on Arch. But I do try other distros in the interim. I'm not talking out of my hoo-ha. So there you go. I do try other distros, and I'm going to stick to this one for 30 days. And then I'm going to, the next one after that will be another universal blue image. I don't remember which one it is. Oh, Bazite. After this one is going to be Bazite. So there you go. I'm trying other things also because I'm bored.
Awesome. All right. So my Linux origin story, I've talked about it a few times, but I'll go in a little bit more detail here. So my first interaction with Linux of any kind was in like 2002. I worked at Little Caesars. It's a pizza joint here in the States, for those of you who don't know. And I was still in high school. It was like my second year of high school. I was like a sophomore. And one of the guys that I worked with, he was a big computer nerd. He handed me a disk that had SUSE Linux on it. I don't know what version. And I too wanted to be a nerd. So I took that home, and we had only had a computer here at the house for about 2 years. We bought it in the year 2000. We got our first computer. It was a Gateway machine. Came in about 26 boxes. Cost about $5,000. And I came home with that SUSE disk and decided I was gonna put Linux on this thing, and I did. I used it for a few days, and it worked fine. From what I remember, it worked fine. I don't know. I don't remember any specific problems I had. The only thing I do remember was that it didn't have Word, and the only thing that I needed a computer really for was Word to do, Word things at the time in high school, right? And I wasn't really proficient enough at all to look for alternatives. Like I don't really remember going through and trying to find like whatever the Office suite for Linux would have been at the time. Probably only Office. I don't think LibreOffice was around at that point. But anyway, so I didn't stick around with Linux for very long. I do remember that SUSE at that point came with GNOME and KDE installed on the disk. Like it had both. Like you could switch in the display manager to GNOME or KDE, and I tried both. And from what I remember of KDE at that point, they were trying really, really hard to be Windows 98, like really, really hard. And that's about what I remember. So I didn't stick with Linux at that point. I went to Windows, back to Windows, probably XP at that point, and then I was there for a little while. And then when I went to university in 2004, for those of you who were around at that time, it was almost a mandatory university rule that you had to have a white MacBook. Like you almost had to. Like if you didn't, you were gonna be on the outside looking in the university. Like you couldn't do anything unless you had a MacBook. So I got one of those white clamshell Macs. They were literally like tossing them at students at Michigan State. Like you could, the campus computer store had those things on like half off, like 90% of the time. It was crazy. Probably reason why everybody had one. So I was a Mac user for probably until 2011, 2010, somewhere around. And then I went back to Windows. And then my final Linux thing was in 2017. My friend Ricky, who I've been podcasting with since 2009, we started a technology podcast, and then we transitioned to basically just reviewing movies together. He asked me, like, would you like to do another podcast? This one about Linux. I was like, sure. So I installed Ubuntu Budgie on my machine, and that's where I started. I completely wiped Windows off, and I haven't really looked back since. I haven't used Windows full time since then, and only recently have I actually decided I had to have Windows again because of DaVinci Resolve. And you guys all know how horrible that has turned out based on my rant in that video the other day. So yeah, I had. I will say when I came back to Linux in 2017, I did not stick with the distro for very long. I was dumb, I didn't know that it was easy to install a different desktop environment on a PC. So a lot of times, so like there was a lot of times I was skipping between Ubuntu flavors. So I would go to Ubuntu, to Budgie, to regular Ubuntu, whatever, just because I wanted to try a different desktop environment. I didn't realize you could install them on your, separately. Eventually, obviously, I did learn that. So I probably hopped 1,000 times in that first year. Like, it's absolutely nuts. I went crazy. I learned how to install Arch. I installed Gentoo at one point. I was not good at it. Really haven't touched Gentoo much since then, just a couple times. And then eventually I became an Arch fanboy because the AUR just blew my mind. Like, all the software you could possibly want, you could just install it with a command. Yes, technically you were compiling, because a lot of those things compile on their own, but you didn't have to mess around with any weird flags or anything like with Gentoo. It just downloads. It's awesome. It's so much good stuff. And I was big into window managers, and window managers often require rare packages and stuff to go along with them, and the AUR had all those things. It was really cool. There's also a lot of stuff to try. At one point, I was just installing shit for no reason, and that's good. And I was on Arch or Arco for quite a long time, and then eventually I decided I was going to go back to hopping, and then I ended up on this 2-year challenge with OpenSUSE, and now I'm home. Steve, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that, I completely forgot about Arco. How the heck did I forget about Arco? This is where my journey on Arch began, through Arch. I'm
How
not talking
did you
about
forget
Manjaro.
about Arco?
Yeah, it was my beginning, and that's how I got to maintaining my own distro. And the other reason why I stuck to Linux ever since, and when I started on Linux was 2019. But within 6 months, I had my distro ready to go. So the reason I stick to Linux and I'm not going anywhere else, not even if my life depended on it, is because it's so much fun. It keeps me occupied forever and ever and ever. There's not a single dull day. There's always something new to do. But Arco Linux is the thing that cemented my stay on Linux. I still had Windows in dual boot, but the day I decided to completely get rid of Windows was Arco Linux. When I got introduced to Arco Linux, I was like, Windows is not needed. I don't need Windows for my use case. What is Windows still occupying space for on my system? So I was like, get rid of that. And I also still have to this day a MacBook from 2016. I'm like, if I want to dabble with something else, I'd rather dabble with Mac OS rather than Windows. Because Windows is, as you said in your video, is a nightmare, especially that for modern hardware, you're stuck with the latest version of Windows. You can't go backwards. Like, if it were up to me, I would stick with Windows 7 if I had to use Windows. I wouldn't budge from Windows 7. Like, my best friend here who lives not far away from me, he still uses Windows 7 to this day because his computer is from 2012. So we don't got money over here, so we stick to what we got. And I'm not budging from Linux ever, 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 not even if my life depended on it, and that's where I'm going to leave it.
Trobus, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just a quick question, Matt. You talk about like a podcast, like your first Linux podcast. Is that still available? That sounds interesting.
This is the first Linux podcast. The Linux Cast started in 2017.
Oh wow!
Yeah,
Okay.
it's been around for a bit now. All the episodes are up except for the first 3. I do have them somewhere, but as I said on the last podcast, they're never going to see the light of day. They're not good. Even though Ricky and I had been podcasting at that point since 2009, we didn't really know what we were doing, and it's not that the audio is bad, it's just we were total Linux noobs, and it was worse than what you think. Like, it was we didn't know shit about Linux, and we got on there thinking that we knew shit. So it did get better. A little bit better, but yeah. Anyways, yeah, this is the original Linux podcast that I did. Kept the name, haven't changed the name. The rest of the channel has kind of grown up around the podcast. The other podcast that we do is the 3cast, and that's been, like I said, that's been since 2009. We've been going strong since then. We don't do it very often though, just like every other month or so. So yeah.
Cool.
All right, so I have another question for you guys. If you had to guesstimate, since you started using Linux, how many distros have you tried? Who wants to answer this question? Steve, go ahead.
Ever since starting my Linux journey, I must have tried around, and I'm not lying here,
Awesome. Okay. Just 1 second, guys. We're having some problems here. All right. Hopefully that didn't end the call.
not the one you're on. I tried another one that was the server one. I tried Red Hat. I had CDs, ISOs laying around. I tried, of course, Arco Linux, Manjaro. I tried so many. It's but I didn't try as many as others. Like you said, you hopped 1,000 times. I didn't do that because once I settled down on Arch, I never moved. And before KDE, before there was a desktop environment before KDE, people think that I stuck with KDE. No, there are 6 months that I call the missing 6 months. I'd like to delete out of my mind because I stuck to Cinnamon for 6 months. Because it was very simple, but it was so damn boring. I was like, what am I doing on this thing? I need something more interesting. That's when I discovered how in-depth KDE can be. And I did try GNOME for a month. And like today, I'm trying Aurora and then Bazite. And then I wanted to try Regatta OS, but from the stream that I'm watching right now, Regatta OS is too complex to mess around with. Oh, and I forgot that I tried CachyOS before it became as popular as it is, because I know the developers, Peter and what's his name? And the other guy, I forgot his name. But yeah, I did try CachyOS. I haven't tried it since, but mainly it's been Arch spins because I know Arch very well. I know how to configure KDE on Arch. I know the packages by heart, and the AUR packages, I either go talk to the developers first because I don't want to bother reading PKG builds. I go straight to get the information from the horse's mouth. And then if it's okay, I use it. I don't bother with reading code, but now I do because I do write shell scripts. So
That's great, Steve. D-Dubs, you're next.
That's a tough question. I'm going to say at minimum 50 to 60 over the years. Some really small ones, some weird ones, I mean, that's a minimum.
Do you have any that you tried that you don't use, obviously, as a daily driver that kind of stick out to you as the interesting ones?
Outside of the norm everybody's aware of. I mean, Boron Labs has a very interesting spin. Might be Buron Labs. I'm not sure which. Bunsen Labs. I'm sorry. Bunsen Labs has one called Boron, which is very interesting. Very well done. Like I say, there's just been so many over the years that I've tried for various, purposes. I've run all the Red Hats and the CentOS and Oracle Enterprise Linux, which I have to run every day now. Honestly, I mean, I always go back to Debian. I mean, if you had to have one, and that was the only one you could run for the rest of your life, it would probably be Debian, honestly. The other ones seem to come and go and change their mind and not figure out what they're trying to do. You get the mess with CentOS and CentOS Stream, and now it's nothing. And it's I'm trying to think of some other ones that were really cool.
Debian does seem to be the rock that kind of just stays.
It's tough to beat overall. It won't have every widget. You'll have to work at it. It will make you work to do something new, or you'll have to accept going to a testing or even worse, a SID, but it's kind of fun, you know.
Yeah.
NixOS would be my next one, but it's it's a lot of work up front, but it's nice when you have it done.
Yeah. All right. Silicoids, you're next.
That's a hard question to answer. I would say 600, 700. I tried them all. Most of the distros I tried in the first 10 years, I think, are pretty much dead. Nowadays, the one I find interesting is uBlue. On my framework laptop, I use Bluebuild to create my own custom version of it. I even added the Fedora Copper for Cosmic so I can test that out on my laptop. It's very interesting what you can do with that kind of stuff nowadays.
Yeah, stuff is very interesting. I'm looking forward to my long-term review of that, of Bluefin. It's going to be fun. Redstone, you're next.
So I'd say I tried about 8 or 9 distros that I really used as a kind of a daily driver. I mean, if I tried, I have more, obviously, but I mean, my switching strategy is like installing the distro on a laptop, trying to use it for some weeks, and then slowly switching over the desktop when it is ready to do it. I've tried, so I've installed on a laptop already OpenSUSE, Fedora, Debian, Nobara, Kubuntu, NixOS, Manjaro, and Arch. And I just wanted to add a funny thing right here. I've actually managed to break Debian more often than Arch.
Well, that's a talent that you should put that on a resume. Yeah. Let's see, Don, you're next.
I'd say about a dozen. I started off with Manjaro as I said before, and then when I came back, I jumped into Fedora, an earlier version, obviously, and then I've also used Red Hat for a while before they started charging and all of that when they were still free. And I've gone through all the majors. I used Manjaro for a while as my daily driver. Did Arch for a while. I pretty much settled on Void Linux and FreeBSD, but Debian is still my first love. So that's kind of my story.
War Thunder?
I don't think I've got quite as many as some people do, but I've probably installed about all of them. The only ones I haven't tried yet, and a couple of them I do want to. I haven't done Void. It's been a hot moment since I did Solus, but for a time I did do Solus. And a couple others. I did do a short stunt into trying to install BSD. Apparently I was just too dumb at the time. I'm probably smart enough now to do it, but I never got past the installer on FreeBSD. So that was my own fault at the time. But I always seem to like come back to something Debian based because it seems to be the one thing I don't typically break. And yeah, I can break Debian. I've done it multiple times, sometimes absolutely hilariously. My favorite being I got it in my head for some reason. I wanted to take LMDE and put it on the SID branch. I don't know why. Don't do that. And so I experiment with things like that. But if I just use the system, it pretty much is rock solid for me, which is why I'm pretty much on LMDE or Linux Mint these days. Really, I prefer LMDE. I like Cinnamon. I like how it's set up. But I've pretty much tried them all and kind of ended up coming back. Arch and I have a relationship like I do with KDE. I want it to work for me, and it just hurts me every single time.
It's an abusive relationship. RBM, go ahead.
First, can I confirm that this doesn't sound like trash? My mic is okay?
Yeah, you sound fine.
Okay, thank you. How's everybody doing? I hope you're all well today. I have not actually used that many distros, despite my overall expertise, like with Linux in general, because I found that it was much more effective to get good at uh, understanding the documentation and stuff instead. So, like I know my way around Ubuntu and Debian and Fedora and various other Red Hat uh, derivatives, and mostly I just stuck to the main like mainstream distros because I found that every time I tried to mess with a different one, all I did was go live in the documentation for like a couple of hours, and I could go from a blank TTY terminal to a fully operable desktop environment or window manager on either X11 or Wayland within like 2 or 3 hours on a brand new distro like I'd never seen it before. Just because documentation is really the key to all of it. Uh, but I got my start actually, if you don't count Ubuntu in like 2004 that I didn't like and I abandoned pretty quickly. Got my start actually on Arch Linux. Same process. Dropped to a TTY and build it up from there. And that was like over 15 years ago now.
Steve, you're next.
Yeah, I just wanted to talk about breaking a distro for a second, because people keep judging distros by the times it breaks on them, and most of the time they don't realize the most important thing, and that is it's most of the time user error. Okay, sometimes Arch likes to kill itself. But in my case, I've been using Arch ever since 2019 in one way or the other, off and on, until I stuck to it. And it never broke on me. I have systems that have been on Arch for over 3 years, almost 4 years now. And it's a rolling distro, and it never managed to kill itself. The only time it killed itself was when the whole grub shenanigans happened, but I managed to fix that within 45 minutes to an hour. Arch will never break to a certain degree where it's unfixable unless you break it yourself. Why judge it and call it something that is unusable when it's easy to fix because of its open nature, because of the way it's created? And I'm not saying this just about Arch. Any distro, when it breaks, it's relatively easy to fix with the right amount of knowledge. And if you don't want to gain that knowledge, there's only one person to blame, and that's you, because you refuse to garner the knowledge in order to fix any issue that might happen on your distro, be it Arch, Debian, whatever. If you keep insisting on ignorance, then there will be no distro for you, because there is no perfect distro out there. There are distros better than others that break less often than others, requiring us to work on them, e.g. Linux Mint, not LMDE, because LMDE requires a certain amount of knowledge to configure it from scratch. But still, there are distros that do everything for you, but they cannot, not everything, but they do enough for you so you don't require to mess around with. But if you don't want to learn and you just want everybody to do everything for you, then Linux is not for you. One person said it very well on the on DistroWatch related to MX Linux. If users prefer ignorance, then those users should not touch Linux. So don't judge a distro because of your ignorance. That's it.
RBM, go ahead.
Yeah, on the topic of breaking distros, a lot of it definitely does come down to ignorance. I don't like to assign that word to users too much because it's just kind of mean to say, but it is still true. And I found that you can break any distro, and it is very difficult to recover from a lot of breakages, even with documentation, even with guides, and even with official guidance from the distro maintainers themselves. You can get in a position where you can't recover it realistically anymore. I know that early on in my Arch years, part of the reason I left it was because of the fact that they do put you in an unrecoverable state on occasion. Primarily, the main one that really annoyed me was when they had a big GPG keyring kerfuffle that predates anything that Manjaro has gone and screwed up, and it was really bad. I did manage to work my way through that, but even still, I just ended up reinstalling afterwards. It was a learning experience. But I do find that, generally speaking, users like new software, and new software breaks. And a lot of distros exist with the express goal of trying to present this new or alternative software to users out of the box and give them a positive experience that they can depend on. A lot of distros don't succeed at this. That's beside the point. But that's why you get a lot of distro hopping based on distro breakage. It's just people really like new software and new features and stuff. That's why you end up with people who are on rolling releases and use the AUR way too reliant on the AUR. There's too much of it. You will absolutely get your system in an unfixable state, sort of, if you rely on the AUR for new software and packages too much. You start to replace your actual like critical system dependencies with those instead sometimes from the AUR, and it gets pretty tough to deal with. So like I said, I wouldn't like to call users ignorant for just not taking the extra step to go fix all this stuff, but it is primarily still a user like issue that it's just a skill issue, I guess is the way that people say it now.
Yeah. So I would like to, just something that you said, Steve, that I would like to push back on just a little bit. I agree with both you and RBM that user ignorance is the cause behind distro breakage a lot of the times, but we can also all agree, I think, that different distros require a different level of knowledge. You have to be more knowledgeable to use Gentoo than you do to use Linux Mint. That's just the truth, right? I mean, you have to know more about Linux to install Gentoo and maintain it than you would ever to if you were going to use Ubuntu or Linux Mint. So I think that calling it ignorance sometimes it is a little not great, simply because it's too generalized of a term, right? People might have some Linux knowledge and then jump into something that they're just not prepared for. Like they have their War Thunder and have used, Linux Mint forever, and then decide, oh, Linux from scratch sounds like a really good idea, and I'm not disparaging you, War Thunder. I'm just, you're in that situation. You've used Ubuntu your entire Linux career, and then all of a sudden Linux from scratch appears on a stream somewhere. Like, yeah, I'm gonna try that. You're probably going to fail because your knowledge just isn't there yet. So, Redstone, you're next.
So the Debian breakages I talked about were not really related to user error, I think. More like a documentation problem, because they mainly appear when I try to install the NVIDIA drivers. And there's no real documented way how to get a X-CUDA version set up on a specific NVIDIA driver. And some guides say download the drivers from NVIDIA, which is a terrible idea, by the way, since this breaks the packages, and you aren't able to update your system anymore. And yeah, and basically I use Debian for all of my AI stuff in my server, and I actually switched to a VM for that, since I didn't want to reset up the host system every time it breaks, since like I said, sometimes they just break all of the packaging and there's no one-to-one guide how to install a CUDA version that is needed for any program I want to run on the server.
Yeah, sometimes we can all agree that documentation is just not great. Also, NVIDIA drivers cause more problems than you think. Steve, go ahead.
Yeah, I need to apologize for saying ignorance, but I didn't mean it in a bad way. I just meant it as what it means. It means not knowing. So there's that, and there's another thing. Yes, there are occasions where, like they said, the NVIDIA drivers might break the system beyond repair, but that's a niche. I call it a niche because it hasn't happened for a long time. The black screen of death, the common black screen of death, is easily recoverable by downgrading or whatever. It just requires a little bit of knowledge. But yes, there are the few occasions where yes, a distro will become unrecoverable. But that doesn't happen as often as it used to before. These days, all breakages have solutions at different levels of in difficulty, but it still requires knowledge. Linux is not the set it up and forget it type of system. There are a few distros that require less hands-on in the system, but overall, Linux requires some level of knowledge. You cannot come into Linux with absolutely no knowledge and refusing to gain any to help yourself. Some people come into Linux expecting it to be like Windows. Hey, install and forget. Download something, next, done deal. And they bash it coming from this perspective. They don't bash it from the perspective of a Linux user. They bash it from the perspective of a Linux user. And they keep doing that. They don't stop. It's not like as time goes by, they learn and they bash less and less and less because of their learning. No, they refuse to learn and they continue bashing it because it's not Windows. It's not Mac OS where you just download something and install, done deal, and you use it.
Yeah.
So I've gotten a lot of flack recently because I am not the type of person who will force people to use what I use. I will never do that. I hate people who do that. But I will say, they ask me, what do you use? I say, I use Arch. I don't see myself moving away from Arch. They start bashing me. It's like, you're using the wrong distro. You need to use that distro. This distro is the best distro in the world because we use it because it's the best for us. Okay, they had bad experience with Arch. That doesn't mean everybody else will have a bad experience with Arch. Not everybody's experience is similar, but they don't see that. Most of the people I encounter in the Linux community don't see it that way. They see it from the perspective, oh, if it doesn't work for me, that means everybody else who uses the X and Y Linux distro will have the exact same issues as me. Plus the variety of configurations and hardware.
Yeah, well, I mean, and it's partially Linux fault. I mean, we wouldn't have the problem that you're discussing, Steve, if we only had one distro. If there's one distro, one desktop environment, everyone used the exact same thing, then everyone would come in and have the same basic experience. You would still have the hardware problem because everyone has different hardware, but you wouldn't have to deal with multiple different package managers, different desktop environments, things like that. And that fragmentation that we talk about, over the course of the last 35 years is, part of the reason why we have some. I mean, if you are someone who has just the barest amount of technical knowledge, and you decide you just basically just enough to install Linux. That's basically where you're at. That's your base level knowledge, and you come in and you expect it to be at least some. I mean, it's going to be different, but it's going to be somewhat like Windows. And this is where the whole desktop environment is looking like Windows kind of is a deterrent, because it by looking like Windows, it makes people think it should be Windows, and that causes problems. And then they start experiencing things that are just completely different, and that causes them issues. And then maybe they learn stuff on how to use Ubuntu, but then they move to Fedora and the process is different and it freaks them out. So I think there's a lot of user responsibility there, but also the Linux ecosystem has some of the blame too. RBM, go ahead. Don't forget to mute yourself.
I just wanted to first, I missed the first part of this meeting today, so I didn't hear about a lot of the origin stories. So I wanted to just pose a question before I forget about it regarding the topic of all these breakages and stuff. I got my inclination to switch to Linux because of Windows breakages and Windows causing me problems all the time. Windows was in my way, causing me problems and breaking and giving me issues that were actually unresolvable, not for both for lack of excuse me, both for lack of documentation and for lack of access to the system and its resources. Like there are some breakages in Windows that you are literally not able to touch. You can't go do anything about them. So that was part of like the main reason why I even took up Linux in the first place. The reason that I started trying it in like 2002 to 2004, whatever that like Ubuntu era was. And like, I just am curious, like we're talking about all the distro breakages on Linux side, which is absolutely true. I do still think that most of those breakages come from the software side rather than the distro end. Like it's just not the distro maintainer's fault. It's not the distro ISO. It's not the distro at fault. It's mostly random. I shouldn't say technically random, but just various software that people want to try out and use is not fleshed out for your use case yet. Sometimes that is the distro's fault. Most of the time it's not. It's a lot of other conflicts that happen. But I just was curious how many people got here into Linux because you couldn't fix Windows enough anymore, like I couldn't.
Jerry's waving his hand just a little bit. Trollbus, go ahead.
Yeah, but I'm gonna just So you mentioned I'm gonna answer a question right after, but first you Matt, you mentioned if there was only one distro and one desktop environment. Well, who here would prefer using like some like personally, if I was forced to use GNOME and Ubuntu, I'd probably be still using Windows, like unironically. I probably would switch like Fedora GNOME. I probably would went back to Windows after. So I don't think it's actually possible to just say, oh, the fragmentation is a problem. I think if we didn't have the fragmentation, half the Linux users wouldn't actually want to use Linux. Personally, I wouldn't want to use Linux. I would rather use Windows 7 than use GNOME, unironically. But yeah, it's just a better user experience. Now, the question about Windows breaking is true. Like for example, I remember that laptop that I first installed Fedora on. It would have this bug where it would install the update, and it would take forever. Then it would say didn't work. It would roll back the update. Would take almost as long, and then it would boot back in, and it would do that every time. Then it would reboot. It would try that again. It would install. It would break, and it would uninstall the update, and then it would roll back. And it would take like an hour. Right, so like that's just a good example. And when you're in that loop of update hell, it's unfixable. You can't fix yourself. You have to reinstall. But yeah, that's just one example of Windows being really bad.
Nuke and pave is literally the only way to fix Windows. That's the only way I know to fix Windows. Jerry, you're next.
Yeah, exactly the same opinion as Trollbus. If Linux had only one of everything, one desktop environment, one distro, yada yada yada, I also wouldn't have touched Linux with a stick, but not because of GNOME. I'm one of the 2 people who genuinely like GNOME.
Weirdo.
For me, if there was only KDE Plasma, no. No. I hate KDE Plasma with a passion. But with Ubuntu, nowadays, I'm with you. I hate Ubuntu. The amount of times it breaks lately, it's insane. I mean, what am I using? Am I using a Linux distribution, or am I using a glorified Windows operating system? Like, yeah. So that said, I really love the choice we have with desktop environments like GNOME, KDE, even though I don't like KDE, XFCE, Cinnamon.
And the window managers like OpenBox or the tiling window managers like Qtile, Hyperland. Yeah.
There is not a fight that the Linux community has that's going to endure longer than KDE and GNOME. That's the fight. War Thunder, go ahead.
I was gonna say you don't like your screens blue when you're using Windows. No, that was kind of I had mentioned it in the chat. Was like Windows being unstable wasn't initially what pushed me into Linux, but like I had some blue screens and some issues and whatnot. Windows 11 100% pushed me the rest of the way off the edge, but I had issues with some of my older hardware and whatnot. And rather than trying to figure it out, because I've broken Windows beyond repair more than once, but really two things are what drove me off the edge, and one of them's not even a thing anymore, and I will still use Linux anyway. The first one was, as some of you may know, I had god awful internet, especially when I got married and moved in here before I had Starlink. I had god awful internet, and not being able to control Windows Update when you have really poor internet is a really big problem, because you'll just be gaming and then your system will just slow to a crawl. Even if you've got 8 or 16 cores or whatever, it'll slow to a crawl trying to do Windows updates because your internet is just absolutely getting pounded into the sand. And I honestly, I was one of the last nails in the coffin for me, was just like, I already have 5 megabit internet or megabyte internet that was just slowing to a crawl. If anything, was completely unusable because Windows wants to update. And I experienced it again last night because my Surface Book has Windows on it right now, and it's driving me nuts because I didn't ask it to update, but yet it said you want to update and then wait 20 minutes to go to bed because you're having to restart to update. Was incredibly frustrating. Now, I have good internet now, so I can even run Arch without a problem, but even running Mint or Mint Debian Edition, my internet was slow enough. It would take me 45 minutes to do a week's or 2 weeks worth of updates, assuming I didn't disconnect in that amount of time or even have a steady connection. So, I mean, getting to use Linux and experiencing an OS that just doesn't need the internet. Like even on an Arch system, or even when I did Tumbleweed, when I went on vacation, I took Tumbleweed with me to challenge myself with Matt's operating system choice. And Tumbleweed just didn't care. Like even 2 weeks later, when I got back online with it, it was like, yeah, you got 1 or 2 packages. I'll just work around that. And Zipper just plowed right through it and it was fine. And it was just refreshing to get to use different systems, DNF or Zipper or whatever. And they're just like, yeah, so you're a little out of date. Who cares? You could come back 6 years from now and I'll still be working. Whereas I've had Windows systems that you're offline for 2 hours and they crap their pants. And I completely do not understand why.
Because Windows. Also, the YouTube chat's having a GNOME versus KDE fight. RBM, go ahead.
They both suck.
Regarding GNOME versus KDE, GNOME versus KDE is definitely going to rage on forever. 100% true. But it pales in comparison to the editor wars. Emacs versus Vim has lived longer than desktop environments existed, and it will go on past the death of them too.
Vim has already won. We already know that.
I do agree mostly that Vim is the way. When I do grab Emacs stuff, I have to put it in evil mode and use all of the Vim key bindings and navigation and stuff. It's just so much better than key cording on Emacs.
I'm not going to try to piss off the Emacs guys. Jerry, go ahead.
Yeah, my origin with Linux is actually probably the weirdest of us all. I got into Linux completely by accident, believe it or not. It started when my great grandfather got a laptop from his nephew, and it had Ubuntu on it. And I was like, okay, let's check this laptop out. Ooh, Windows Vista. Windows Vista was great. Yes, I'm full of unpopular opinions. I know. And pretty quickly I noticed, hold up, this is not the Windows Vista I know. What am I even looking at right now? So I peeked inside the settings, played around with everything, noticed it's Ubuntu, and then yeah, it's pretty good. Why not try to use it as a daily driver? So back when Ubuntu 14.04 LTS released, I installed it, liked it, but I immediately had to move back to Windows because my school mandated the use of Microsoft Office. LibreOffice didn't have Microsoft Office compatibility yet, so I I had the choice: use Linux or just suck in school, because if they see you submitting something that is not in the Microsoft Office format, you immediately got a 6, which is an F in American schools. Immediately. They didn't even open it. No. You immediately got a 6. So I moved back to Windows, but I kept Linux in mind. And yeah, over the years, I took a look at Ubuntu a bunch of times. Also, Fedora Manjaro was my first Arch-based distro. And I was like, damn, Arch sucks. Well, should have used a proper Arch-based distro. And yeah, when Windows 11 released, it was, I hated it. I really hated it. I updated my Windows 10, rebooted, and immediately Windows 11 booted up. Like, what the hell? we all know how Windows is with updates, especially forced updates. And yeah, when my friend came up with the idea, we try making our own Super Mario 64 mod, but this time with the decomp. Then I installed Linux, because you have to use the WSL or Linux to build the ROM. And yeah, after that, I accidentally wiped my Windows, and it took me like 4 weeks to notice. And that's when I was like, okay, I don't need Windows anymore.
Awesome. Redstone, you're next.
So I have a little fun Windows experience on my server, which was running in a VM. I was just doing something over my Moonlight connection, since I am not have HDMI cable from my server to my monitor, and suddenly the connection just breaks. I look over to the monitor on my server rack, and it just says restarting. So Windows just auto-updated and restarted without asking. The work was basically gone. And I had another experience with Ubuntu Server. I went to update the NVIDIA graphics drivers, and apt was like, you need the newer kernel for that. Wait, I'm going to install the Microsoft Azure kernel for you. I rebooted the system, not knowing what was going on, and just no display output, didn't show up in the network, nothing, until I realized as I was going into the grub boot menu that it had completely installed a kernel that would obviously not run on a real world system, just in a VM container.
Love Ubuntu too. Steve, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that about the Windows breakages thing. Nobody's gonna believe this, not even you, Matt. But ever since I started using Windows 7, starting from when Windows 7 was released, I don't remember the date. It only broke on me once, and Windows never broke on me ever since. I upgraded to Windows. I skipped 8 and 8.1. I upgraded directly from Windows 7 to Windows 10, and then from Windows 10 to Windows 11. Not a single issue. I never suffered anything. I never had a blue screen. I never, ever, ever, ever had an unbootable system. The only issue, minor issue, it's the same thing as KWin breaking. It's the exact same. It's the clone of KWin crashing. Explorer was crashing a little bit too often than I'd like, but nothing major that would allow me to knock my head against the wall, because I wasn't using it like a madman. and I wasn't downloading things from the dark web or whatever. I was just using it as a normal user, downloading things from the right places. And now I'm not gonna pretend to be an angel. I did Jack Sparrow a lot of things, to put it the best way. I relied only on Jack Sparrowing because of the situation in my country. But even with that, I never managed to break my Windows installation enough to wipe it. The only thing that made me wipe it was the discovery of Linux. That's it. Not because it broke on me or exploded in my face or any drivers broke or anything. That's it. I could be one of the niche people to whom this never happened, but hey, I'm happy.
What I heard there, Steve, was that you like Windows. RBM, go ahead.
Yeah. I remember having to do. I had developed like a maybe a bi-monthly like nuke and pave situation with Windows all the way back from 98 Millennium Edition and XP, and it carried through all the way until at least Windows 7. Windows 7, I did not have to do it as frequently anymore, but I was a better user by that point too. I had an additional 8 to 10 years of experience dealing with computers at that point. And Windows also locked things down even tighter to make it more difficult to break some things. But I still ran into problems all the time. Like the registry gets out of whack in weird ways. Software doesn't fully uninstall. It leaves litter everywhere all the time. You can't do anything in like Windows 32 or System 32 folder, where like big danger zone if you even step into there. There's ownership permission and problems with that you are very difficult to resolve. When something gets permissions mixed up on a Windows system, they are so difficult to do anything about. There is not really a good utility for users to fix a lot of these problems with. And like you can't drop to a terminal to do a lot of stuff either. Like it just doesn't have terminal utilities in most cases. But I also know tons of people who use Windows all day, every day. It's the only operating system they've ever been on, and they've never reinstalled it on their laptop. They've just it has degraded and gotten slower and slower and slower and slower, and eventually they just stopped using the laptop because it's so slow. But they never actually had like a crash or a problem or a breakage that they needed to get fixed. And I would know because I'm the one that they call for that. They do eventually just give up on the computers though.
Yeah. So I think that Windows users in specific have a frog in water problem. They started out in cold water when Windows was good, and then since then it's just basically been boiling around them, and they didn't realize. And the reason why I say that is not because Windows is inherently unstable for a lot of people. The vast majority of people use Windows for ages and ages, and like you said, RBM, it just gets slower, and then when it's so slow they can't use it, they go buy a new computer. Or if they happen to have an IT guy in their family or whatever, they'll point at them, and then the IT guy will say, well, I can't fix this, I'm nuking and paving, because that's the only real solution to a Windows problem. I think one of the reasons why when I tried Windows 11, when I got this Windows box, that I was so shocked by is because I hadn't used Windows for so long. I didn't like I always knew that I had Windows problems. Like there was the update problem, like Redstone talked about. That happens to a lot of people. The whole restarting because it just, I need to restart now. I don't give a shit what you're doing. Like it doesn't matter if you are in the middle of open heart surgery and you're requiring this thing, that thing is going to restart because it says it needs to. So I always knew that those problems existed, and those are just Windows quirks you have to put up with. But because I went so long without using Windows, going back into it, made me just felt like it made it easier for me to see all the flaws and stuff like that. And the thing about the Windows stuff now is just like I said in that video, it's like people. It feels like Windows has, or Microsoft has gone out of their way to make Windows as bad as possible, and it feels like a weird business decision because it feels like they've gotten so arrogant to the point where they think like, well, nobody's going to ever use something different because we're all there is, and therefore we can do whatever we want with it. And I don't think that that's true. Like even if you take Linux out of it, because I mean a lot of people aren't going to Linux, Mac does exist. Like people can go buy a MacBook, and yeah, it's gonna be expensive, more expensive than a Windows PC, but it's not as crappy as Windows is. It's weird. Also, how on earth did our Linux user group get onto Windows? What is wrong? I mean, what is wrong with us? Seriously, we went somewhere completely wrong. Jerry, go ahead.
It's all the PTSD from the blue screens.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the issue isn't only that people don't realize how bad Windows has become. Also, I said it before in a previous log. There are people who just have been using Windows for the last decades and they don't want to switch. They refuse to look at anything else but Windows. Like my grandparents who refuse to use Windows, and for the pretty I would say impossible case that Windows dies, they will just stop using PCs altogether and do everything with their phones and tablets. But yeah, the thing is, that's also why casual people don't take a look at Linux, because Linux still has people still say Linux is too hard. You have to use the command line. You have to go back to the MS-DOS days because of the command line, which isn't true anymore. Not at least not for everything, but still, yeah, that's also a reason why people won't take a look at Linux.
Well, and most people don't interact with Windows either. They just spend all their time in Chrome. I mean, for the vast majority of normal people, Chrome is their operating system. That's one of the reasons why
That's true.
Chrome OS has become such a big thing. It's because that's basically what people use. They use Chrome. They don't interact with Windows. Like, the only time my mom, who is the only Windows user in my family now, uses, or the only time she'll interact with Windows is when she has to reboot the computer. So, like that's literally every time. Everything else is just Chrome. RBM, go ahead.
I wanted to go ahead and let Trolbus speak first. I've had a lot of time on the air.
Oh, okay.
Oh,
Trolbus,
thanks.
go ahead.
I wanted to so for the thing about people not wanting to switch over, it kind of reminds me, I think it's not even just Linux, like even like Windows users switching to Mac OS, like I think it's even more widespread of a problem, because like if you look at something even more used than personal computers, phones, right? There's extreme brand loyalty. Like iOS users will never touch an Android phone, right? Like the majority of them, we're talking about the people that don't have a computer at home, right? They only have a phone. The majority of people actually, which is crazy to me. But they actually would never want to touch the other side. And I guess there's probably the same thing on the Android side. People that use an Android, they would never want to touch an Apple device. Not because they have like an ideological idea, but personally I would never touch an iOS because it's proprietary and I use Lineage OS. But I'm talking about just because they're scared of changes, right? And that's probably just like the typical user. Like we have to realize that it's not just a Linux issue, it's like a widespread issue where if you're in like an ecosystem, even if it's as bad as Windows, these people don't want to learn, they don't want to change. It happens on the mobile phones, it happens everywhere. So it's like even more deeply rooted into the human conscience than just Linux. Why people don't switch to Linux, right? We have to, like, it goes all the way to like Mac OS, right? Because Mac OS, you would think people would switch to that, but it's deeper than that. Like the average like iOS user is never going to get an Android phone. Like you have to keep that in mind.
Jerry?
Yeah, and about the brand loyalty, I have a perfect example of me yesterday, because yesterday my new phone, I switched from iOS to Android, and a lot of my friends, they were saying like, dude, are you insane? Why are you leaving the best phone there is for a crappy Android device? Guys, it's a Pixel 8. It's perfectly fine. In fact, it's even faster than my buddy's iPhone 15 Pro, which is insane. So that's the brand loyalty. I dropped out of the Apple ecosystem, more or less. I'm still using a Mac right now, but for example, my webcam is still my iPhone 12 Pro. But as the thing with the brand loyalty is, when people get attached to it, they do not want to leave it. It took me like 8 years to drop out of the iPhone ecosystem again.
Brand loyalty is not a tech-specific thing. People have been fighting Ford versus Chevy for 150 years, 100 years, or whatever. So
Samsung versus Apple.
yeah. So it's not a tech-specific thing. RBM, go ahead.
Yeah. So, man, I do like Android phones better, but I did also use an iOS phone for a long time. It was always just fine. The one thing that I miss from iOS is that it does much better autocorrect. I can't find a keyboard on Android that can do autocorrect properly. If you miss the space button and you tap B or V or whatever right on top of it on a QWERTY layout, it will just consume that and say that, and like if you continue to type afterwards, it won't figure out that there's a word in there that you want to put a space in between instead. It just can't do that. I don't know why. On iOS, you could just press space at the end of like 3 typos, and it'll figure it out. I don't know why, don't know how, but that was really convenient, and it's very frustrating now, several years later, still to this day, that I can't get such like convenient autocorrect.
Try out Futo keyboard.
I am right now, actually, and it is not doing it. It is just giving me the same problem. It is something else is going on that I can't figure out. But also, we ended up on the Windows topic a lot because it is like almost everybody's origin story comes from Windows,
Mm-hmm.
and you have to reference it back to even like make most conversational points about what you're doing on Linux, because you need a focal point and a reference point.
Well, and
So
also
it's not that weird, I guess.
Well, also when all it takes is one person to mention Windows in a group of Linux nerds, and all of a sudden it's like piranhas. We all got to get in there and talk about how horrible Windows is. And one of the things I tried to do when I made that last video was, and I didn't do a good job, and I tried to constantly remind myself of this. And whenever a conversation comes up where we ask why people don't switch to Linux, and there's just some people, there's some people who don't know what Linux is. Some people have no interest in Linux whatsoever if they do know what it is. But also there are people who just have to use Windows because they, there's pieces of software, there's, there's hardware limitations, whatever it is, and there's also people who are in a situation where they've decided to use both because they have to keep Windows around, but they prefer Linux. And I think that a lot of times when there's like a group of us around where we're all primary Linux users, we sometimes tend to disparage those who do have to keep Windows around and try to tone that down just a little bit. But the whole Android versus iOS thing is always interesting to me because at the end of the day, they're basically the same. Like they really do. I mean, it wasn't always the case. At one point, iOS was way better than Android. Then there was a little while there where it felt like Android was way better than iOS. And it really does depend on what you want in a mobile operating system. I think the thing that always gets me is that iOS has basically for the entire time period of mobile operating systems from 2007 onwards, basically since the App Store, I guess, is it feels like the apps on iPhone are better by by a wide margin. They're designed better, they function better for whatever reason. It's not universal, but for the most part, I always prefer like if I had two apps that are exactly, like they're the same app, but one's on Android, one's on iOS. Usually the iOS one, for whatever reason, is better in terms of UI and performance and battery life and stuff, for whatever reason. Steve, go ahead.
I just wanted to say the whole thing about iOS and Android. It's a debate that will never be won. It's so the same debate goes with the same thing goes with the debate with related to various Linux distros. There will be nobody will agree on a single distro. Same thing happens with iOS and Android. They each have their pros and cons. Same thing with distros. Every distro has its own pros and cons, but the way things are going currently in the Linux community, it's exactly like Android versus iOS. People are constantly bickering and arguing about whose distro is the best. So this type of argument is similar with many things. It's not only iOS versus Android or Linux distros. It goes with everything because we all have our own opinions. But the Linux community, as it stands right now, is full of opinionated people. And I want to say one thing, Matt. Your server is one of the servers that has the least amount of opinionated people, and I enjoy my time on your server because I don't know if it's you or what's his name, Yorish, whatever.
Yoris, yeah.
Yeah, Yoris. You guys are doing a great job by filtering out all the negative views on the server. Yesterday alone, I spent, I don't know, God knows how many hours on your server, and I enjoyed every moment of it. But the thing is, I'm part of countless servers, and a bigger number of servers I'm part of, unfortunately, are full of opinionated people who really think their opinion is the only opinion that matters. But thank you, Matt and Joris, for making your community one of the best I've ever been part of. So yeah, there's that. And one last thing I want to say is Linux is so awesome because of the freedom it provides. We are free to do whatever we want with whatever distro. And some people say that, hey, I downloaded this distro, I installed it on my system, I don't like it because they forced X and Y on me. I'm like, all distros are what the creator thought would be great for most people, but it doesn't mean it's going to be great for you. So if you don't like it, switch to one that gives you the things you want. If you don't find any, learn and create your own. I did that, and I was as ignorant as can be, and I still am when it comes to development. I'm not a developer, I'm a maintainer. I'm a script maintainer. My scripts were 98% in my toolkit were written 98% by ChatGPT and 2% me fixing the issues instead of it being all the way around, because I fell on a model in ChatGPT that is very good at coding. So I only have to fix a few things, and I made a lot of good friends on your community, Matt. One of them being Oglo, another being VLK. Both those guys helped me tremendously in my bash scripting adventures. So it's all about learning. Yeah. The more you learn, the happier you're going to be on Linux. If you refuse to learn, then your experience will continue to be very difficult.
Yeah.
Thank you, Matt.
Yeah. War Thunder, you're next.
I was going to say, since this came up at work, it's fresh in my mind. It's about sunk cost fallacy as well. It's kind of an interesting point to make. If you've always done one thing in your life and that one thing has always worked for you, then why change it? You know, if people have always used Windows, Windows always worked well for them. Why change that? Why reinvest in something else? Just like if Matt uses OpenSUSE for 10 years, why would he switch to Debian? He knows OpenSUSE. He's invested in OpenSUSE. He knows OpenSUSE. And I think that does happen a lot of times in the community when you have heads butt over different distributions and whatnot, where, oh, I've used it for 5 years and this is the best thing ever. Well, so is the other person. You know, they've used it for however many years and they know it. And that's what they want to do because it works for them. And why change what works, right? So I thought that was an interesting point to kind of throw out there. Is I think it happens a lot out there when you find an iPhone or an Android or Firefox versus Chromium versus like whatever you've used your whole life is what you know, and why would you want to change? And the other side is trying to change the other one's mind when, you know, that's probably not the right way to go about it.
If we were able to eliminate the feeling of needing to pull everyone over to the what we use, like why do I care that someone else likes to use Emacs? I shouldn't care. Like if you like Emacs, good for you. It's not for me. I'm not going to use it. Just same thing with like NixOS. NixOS, tried it for a long time, didn't care for it. Right? It's not my cup of tea. Ubuntu, like I haven't used Ubuntu in years now, and I have no interest in doing so. Just not for me. It's a perfectly fine distro. Although I guess I technically I just told a big fat lie because I actually have Ubuntu on my home server, regular Ubuntu with GNOME. I don't have it used in years, so you know it's one of those things. But there's this feeling in all society really like this is not a Linux problem where if we use something and we like something, we don't see a reason why you shouldn't also like it, and if you don't like it, then therefore you are a communist. Basically, is the argument there? I guess.
Not wrong.
Right. I mean, it's just it's some of it has to be political, some of it's human nature, and it's something we do have to kind of fight against because as you get more entrenched in the Linux community, you're going to find it over and over again. Like it's like a forum syndrome. Like you go into a forum, you're going to be surrounded by a bunch of sharks who all like the exact same thing and are so invested in it that they actually dived into a forum to talk to other nerds about that thing. And this is not again, it's not a Linux problem. If you're into like Harry Potter fandom, and you go to like a Harry Potter forum, you're gonna come up across people who the stupidest thing. Their distro conversation is the ships in Harry Potter, like the romantic relationships. Like it's the stupidest thing. Like who gives a crap? You just like what you like, but they fight and get insanely mean over the things that they like against people who don't like the same thing. It's a weird human nature thing. Redstone, go ahead.
The thing with Linux is that many people say, I have to use the command line. No, I don't want to do that. It's much too complicated for me. And what I always say is, I mean, you got the CMD or what's called terminal in Windows. How often do you use it? Like never. A typical Windows user does not typically use the terminal, and the same is luckily now also the same for Linux. Most changes you can just do fine through GUI. Just because I use the terminal, it's just because I feel more comfortable with doing so. I mean, if you like to do everything graphically, you can of course do that. And also on the Android and iOS debate, I personally always will stick to Android since it's, in my opinion, a bit better for longevity of the device. I mean, I'm still using an S8 today from Samsung, and just because I can keep it live with updates and so on through EOS and other ROMs, and my next phone won't also be necessarily something really powerful, rather something you can mod and expand the lifetime of, since I don't want to switch my phone every 5 years or so. But again, if someone here likes to daily drive an iPhone, no problem with that.
On the terminal thing, I think one of the problems that we have when it comes to the command line is that when you search for something on how to do something, the vast majority of tutorials out there are going to tell you how to do it in the command line. So therefore, it perpetuates the stereotype that you can only do it in the terminal, which isn't true. It's just that the documentation for the GUI stuff is either non-existent, or so for example, if you try to figure out how to do something GUI in KDE, a lot of the KDE docs still show screenshots from like KDE 4, and that turns people away really fast. Trollbus, go ahead.
Yeah, so we were talking about like the Linux evangelism and the infighting and all of that, and I'm against the infighting. I think it's pointless about like talking about, like, I don't care what you use on Linux, but personally, what I want to do when I talk to other people and I talk about Linux, it's not because I necessarily like Linux, it's because I want to move people over to free Libre software. That's what I actually care about. Like, I don't care if you use FreeBSD. I don't care if you use GNOME. I don't care if you use something that I would never touch, because what I actually care about, like, same thing you said earlier, that you think that iOS and Android are pretty much the same thing nowadays. I really do think the same way, because they're basically both proprietary garbage that spies on you. So that's why I use Lineage, right? I only really care about free software, and that's what I want to do. I want to spread free software to as many people that don't know about it as possible. Even if you're a Windows user, you can use free software. I switched to using LibreOffice and GIMP and all these things before switching to Linux, and I think that's a really good thing you can do to help people move over at first. But yeah, that's the thing, is that I don't care what you actually use. I just want people to learn about free software and use it.
Good point. RBM, go ahead.
So the problem about like the infighting and all of that tends to, like, and telling people like, use my distro or use this one or that one, you're doing this one wrong, or you shouldn't be there, you should be here. A lot of that definitely comes down to a documentation problem of the GUI elements of every distro, because GUI elements move around a lot, like frequently. It's really hard to keep your screenshots up to date in a guide based on a GUI piece of software. And the reason why almost all like primary results on search engines for guides and tutorials results in terminal-based solutions, and is because the interface is typically stable. Like, you can go and get the same command on Ubuntu from approximately 20 years ago, and it'll still probably work today in a lot of cases. Like, you can still apt install the same package that you could 20 years ago, and it'll just work the way that you expect it to. But if you have to describe to somebody to go to the software center, which may or may not even be obvious to them that it even exists on their system, like, how do you tell them to navigate the menu, the system menu, to find the application, then to go to this region of the screen of the GUI like window and click this part, and then go over here to, like, it's really hard to describe that, especially in text. You have to use screenshots and visual aids.
Mm-hmm. And every
distro really hard.
uses a different software center, and they call it something different. So you got Discover, and you got GNOME, Snap Store.
Yeah, there's a lot of that.
Yeah.
That's why I really appreciate, or why I don't use GNOME, but I do very much appreciate and agree with a lot of their approach to the desktop environment and being a unified like environment, because it's getting better and better and better that you can actually describe how to do things in the GNOME environment, and it won't be different next week. Well, but you can't do that in like KDE very easily.
Kind of, but you also have to take into account that, like, if you're using Fedora, that's true. But if you're using the GNOME version on Ubuntu, completely different, because Ubuntu does things.
You're right about a lot of that too.
What we need is we need to steal the Arch wiki from Arch and remove the Arch from it, and basically just make that we need a Linux wiki is what we need, and the Linux community just needs to go in there and keep it up to date as a whole. You know what I mean? And if everyone, a lot of people, I'm not saying gonna be everyone, but if a lot of people contributed to it and kept it up to date, you know, similar to like Wikipedia, like yeah, Wikipedia has its problems obviously, and it requires a lot of money and moderation to maintain because you have assholes in every corner, and the Linux wiki would be exactly the same. But I really do think that if we had one central place where, you know, it wouldn't matter what distro you used, it wouldn't matter what desktop environment you were using, it doesn't matter. We could point to that piece of documentation, that's where you could go. It would be so much better because it would be community maintained instead of being reliant on the distros or the software developers to maintain their documentation, because I love developers. They're fantastic. Without them, we wouldn't have Linux and all this fantabulous software, but they're shit at maintaining documentation. They're really bad at it. They're either really bad at it or they have no interest in doing so. And that means that they're not able to keep up with it or have no interest in keeping up with it, and therefore their documentation is bad. So if we had one place, like one website, just the Linux wiki, where, you know, as much stuff, like if the documentation on there doesn't exist, someone would go create it, and then over time that would become this big giant compendium of awesome, you know, it'd be the Encarta of Linux knowledge. I think we really do need that. I just don't know if anybody's willing to do it. RBM, go ahead.
I do agree with you that we could use that. But one thing that I find very, very troubling, it's only getting worse now, but this has been a problem for several years. Like I would say we're approaching a decade of this issue, where also a lot of Linux like guides and tutorials and stuff are, they're actually just SEO keyword trash instead of actual guides and tutorials now. There are, like, I don't want to call out any particular website right now by name, but there are several.
Make use of. Sorry, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to say that out loud.
that's for sure, like a very straightforward example. But also, people are doing this on their personal blog, or they resemble personal blogs anyway. I can't actually tell if they're personal blogs, but there's one in particular that comes to mind right now that I don't know if it's the personal blog. I don't know anything about it. So, but it just comes up in every search that I do about stuff. And it is so close to actually being like a decent guide, but it's littered with just like so much filler junk all over the place to like just grab SEO, like keyword. It's just flooding with keywords all the time, and it gets really hard to actually filter through that stuff. Like the average user is not going to be able to do it. I have been doing it for roughly 30 years, sifting through search results, and like it's really hard for me to do it now and find good like answers and solutions because they've turned into this SEO goop.
Well, Google has got. I mean, I talked about this on the Patreon pod that I did yesterday. I've started self-hosting Circs, and one of the reasons why I did that was because Google search has gotten so astonishingly bad, and it's not just obviously Linux results; it's everything. But it's just so bad, and it's because they've basically allowed everyone to game the system, like you say. Like if you know SEO and you're able to play that game well, you're going to be up on top. And just because you are really good at SEO doesn't mean you're very good at literally anything else. You just create the crappiest content with the most ads on it, you know, and that's not. I mean, it doesn't serve the greater good for that type of thing. That's why. So, I mean, a lot of stuff, just to be a Linux nerd about it, like a lot of the stuff would be much better if it was open source, because if we had like an open source search engine like Circs that was actually like its own search engine, that'd be awesome. I know like Brave has tried, but they didn't really open source their stuff, and nobody uses it. Like people just use Google. It's the same thing with like Chrome. Like people just use Chrome. It's the default thing. It's become the Kleenex of facial tissue. Like you don't say you're gonna get facial tissue. You're gonna go get Kleenex. You're gonna Google something. You're gonna, you know, it's a problem. And maybe this antitrust thing that they just lost will help solve some of it. I don't think so, but maybe. I mean, they kicked Microsoft in the pants in the late 90s, and Microsoft is still worth $4 trillion. So I doubt it's going to fix anything. War Thunder, go ahead.
I was going to say, it sounds like, Matt, you're going to go ahead and write this entire wiki for us, go ahead and self-host it on all your systems, and never turn that computer off so we can all access that. And then we'll get on the bandwagon when we think it's good enough, all right?
Right,
You just go ahead and do that.
That's exactly the problem, is that you're all waiting for me to do it. The thing is like I had a plan. I actually bought the damn domain that I was going to do on. It was distrodb.net or whatever, and I had it for a couple years. It was a good domain, and just never did. I let it go by. I tried to give it to John, one of the guys who used to do the LUG here, but he apparently didn't want it. So that domain is gone, and I now have to wait till I come up with the next domain idea. So, but it's just one of those things. Like, I really do. If we could get a group of us together to do that type of thing, all it would take is to get started. Like, if we could get the platform up on a server somewhere, get someone who has at least a fair bit of money so they can host it. Like, it doesn't even have to be a lot, and then get the base level knowledge on there, like how to install Linux and all that stuff. It would slowly snowball into effect, especially if we could, once it started creating, I could talk all to my YouTuber friends, and we could all promote it and say, hey, go here. We're all going to contribute to this thing to make it the premier documentation source for everything Linux and open source. I mean, it's just
right. Because like you're like me and like probably many other people, you have your own like knowledge base of all the things you've dealt with and figured out, because I think you're a little bit like me. I can't remember what happened 2 hours ago, let alone, what I did on my server 6 months ago. So you already are building your own little knowledge base, and really it is just taking all these people that know a little bit of everything and just kind of merging it all into one big database per se.
Yeah, we just got to do it. I just don't know where we're going to start. Redstone, go ahead.
The thing I find most annoying when searching for some solutions or pre-made configs, or even in the context of coding, is when such blog posts, I call them, from that were made with this toolkit called Medium show up, because you literally can't copy out the code that is written in there, since the formatting is completely garbage. You can basically completely type everything off the website, since they don't really format it correctly. Not sure why, but yeah, that's what I wanted to say. And basically, this search engine degradation, I mean, I've mostly find my stuff, but I mean, I'm using start page which is a search engine that bases off of the Google index. So I don't know how long it will be good now, but actually I didn't have major problems with it yet. And if I don't find something, I mean, there's always ChatGPT to ask. I mean, yeah, that's what I do when I can't fix the issue myself, but with searching the internet.
Yeah, ChatGPT is going to be the thing. All right, folks, I think that we're going to wrap this thing up here. We've been going for a couple hours. This was a fantastic LUG. So all those of you who watched live, thank you for watching live. The YouTube chat was very lively today. About half of the time they were going through and talking GNOME versus KDE, which I found absolutely hilarious. And then when someone mentioned Vim versus Emacs, they transitioned to Vim versus Emacs. And then there was one person was like, Nano, like, I banned that person. I didn't actually. Should have. But anyways, thanks everyone who watched live. We do the LUG 2 times a month. It's the second Thursday and the fourth Thursday of every month. The first Thursday is always in the morning, 11:15 a.m. Eastern time. The fourth Thursday is always at 8:15 p.m. Eastern time. If you want to join us, you have to join the Discord server. That link will be in the video description, and it's on the video description of every Linux Cast video, so you can join in. I will share the link to the Jitsi call in the Discord server only. That's my little moderation tool to keep the trolls out, because it doesn't always work, but sometimes it works. But anyways, if you want to join, that's the best way to do it. Thank you all for watching the Linux Cast LUG, or whatever. We really do need an official name. It's just LUG is a little bit too generic. But anyways, that's it for this one. Thanks everyone who joined on the LUG. You guys, that was a fantastic conversation. It was very, very good. And we will see you guys all next time. So thanks for everybody watching live. Thanks to all you guys. See you next time. All right.